right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to CRPN Central, the podcast where we bring some of the best in the industry to talk about some of the hardest challenges that we have so that we can talk together, find solutions that help everyone, and get something done. Please remember, CRPN is free education on YouTube. Please be sure to like, comment, subscribe, support the CRPN mission so that we can do more for you, so that we can bring research to the masses. Coming on to stage is our co-host for the day, Miss Edie Edens. Hi, Edie.
Hello.
How you doing?
I'm great. I am so happy to be here. I know this was a bit of a short notice, so I so appreciate you bringing me in at the last minute and that I was able to actually make this work.
Absolutely. And Edie, I know that we've only got you for 30 minutes, so we want to talk about it as much as possible. For those of
Heck
you who
yeah.
are wondering, why is Edie on this podcast? Would you be willing to tell us why Edie is associated in some way, shape, or form with decentralized technologies?
Absolutely. So not only have I been a proponent of bringing trials to patients in unique and unthought of models even prior to COVID, and was an outstanding advocate during that time period, I've also spent the last month plus working with MedVector, who I know you're familiar with as well, and beginning to really explore what we are doing in this space with the new recently released guidance and what that opens the door for us to be able to do in our trials. So just particularly keen on the topic. It's a great time to be having this conversation. And I know we have some great speakers who are going to join us today.
Absolutely. And if you haven't had a chance, please check out medvector.com. Talk to Ted Bartis, Scott Stout. The team is growing. And so on our stage today comes Haley Duguay, Craig Lipsett. How are you all today?
Hi, doing great. How are y'all?
Oh, this is like a dream come true. When I was editing this podcast and I heard how much each of you had in common and the stories that you had to tell and the alignments that we all have, I just couldn't wait for this live event. This is just so much fun.
This is going to be fun. I love this, and I'm really glad to be here with all of you. Let's go.
Let's go. So before we start, Craig, I have to say this is kind of timely for a couple of things. We might get into it, but number one is I could have sworn you had a crystal ball when we had this interview because we were talking about that draft guidance becoming final. And then all of a sudden, that must have been the week after we recorded this, something happened. And on top of that, DTRA last weekend. How was it? What'd you think?
You know, we got that final guidance on DCT, and we got a new draft guidance on running randomized clinical trials in routine care settings, which just doubles down and picks up on, I think, one of the most exciting parts of that final DCT guidance, that theme around the ability to include HCPs, healthcare providers in communities supporting routine care activities. And all of that was definitely a good theme for us to pick up on at the DTRA annual meeting last week in Boston. DTRA, for friends in the community that aren't familiar, is a nonprofit collaboration with about 60, 70 different pharma companies and site networks and patient orgs and health systems, tech service providers around the globe. The annual meeting brought together a couple of hundred of those folks, including some great voices from FDA and from European regulators as well. Our chief medical officer from EMA was there. But those voices from FDA were a great opportunity to pick on those themes from the final guidance, to talk about some of the opportunities for sponsors to take advantage of some of the clarity that's been put out there.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And we'll get into that. Let's ask Haley. Haley, would you be willing to introduce yourself real quick?
Yeah, my name is Haley Duguay. I'm the site director for MSB Neuroscience. And in addition to our traditional brick and mortar site, we've also been working as a decentralized site for the last couple of years.
Awesome. And so, Craig, I know DTRA, I know that you have a really cool background. Real quick, introduction.
So I'm Craig Lipsett, and I am the co-chair for DTRA. I also work independently as a board member and advisor with different orgs on the faculty here in New Jersey at Rutgers University in health informatics, and previously was the head of innovation, clinical innovation over at Pfizer for a number of years. But today I just get to spread my time across a lot of great people and organizations.
That's the funnest part, Craig, because you get to meet these people with really cool ideas that want to take it somewhere.
Oh, it's great. And people that are looking to bring those into their organizations, whether sponsors or some health institutions or advocacy groups that are looking to bring these forward for their patient communities. So it's a great convergent space in which to live.
Mm-hmm.
So just to get this straight, and I feel so very blessed. So first and foremost, thank you to both of you for being willing to come onto this podcast. But we have a site who has DCT logistics, and they've done very well. They've been audited by the FDA. They've done everything right, and they've got it going. And now we've got an advocate who's a co-chair for a nonprofit dedicated to decentralized technologies, who's integrated into the industry to try to advocate for decentralized technologies throughout the industry. What a showstopper of a podcast. I don't know if you saw the comments when we announced this, but there are some very excited people to talk about or to watch what we're talking about today.
Awesome.
That's exciting.
Thanks for bringing us all together and for making this space happen. It's great.
Oh, I love
Absolutely,
it.
Absolutely.
So let's start with an icebreaker question for both of you. And so you both had a chance to kind of review the podcast recording and each other's interviews, right?
Yes.
So I wonder, and we'll start with Haley. When you listen to these podcasts, the two interviews, did you identify anything that was similar? Like, oh my gosh, I said that, or whatever it might be.
Well, it's been about a month, so I don't quite remember similarities that stuck out specifically.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm kind of like Haley. It's been a minute, and I feel like I've had a lot of conversations since. But I do think some of those themes about, breaking this into pieces that make them accessible, right? Like, I think when some people hear these terms, they think we're just talking about science fiction or something that's just, hard to wrap your head around. It's some completely different way to run studies, and I think some of the common themes, at least to me, were that we can break this down into just the way the FDA describes it in their final guidance. It's just tools. These are just
tools,
decentralized elements to include. It's not crazy. And by the way, I loved how you set up Haley that that her organization's been audited or inspected with FDA, and that too is in that same theme that the same rules apply. This isn't some crazy far out set of approaches. You can survive an inspection with these methods. Data integrity, patient safety. There'll be questions asked. You can handle that.
So Edie,
I liked it. I was going to say, I was reviewing the podcast before I hopped on, and I liked the way you framed it, Craig, in yours, basically saying exactly what you just said, but even in more granular level of find what we can say yes to. Instead of saying no to the whole idea at large, right? Categorically just no, and being naysayers, which reg attorney, I know a little bit about being a naysayer, right? Instead, let's break it down into what it is and what it's not, and realize that we have to start somewhere and create digestible pieces we can say yes to in that toolkit. And I think so often we get caught up that this is an either or situation. You're either a completely decentralized trial, right? Or you're a completely brick and mortar traditional trial. And that's not really mostly the case, at least in my experience, my humble opinion, for the vast majority of folks who are using these tools. They're quite in between those two. There may be, outliers, and they may have the ability to do it completely decentralized for some patients, but most are taking advantage of some pieces, not others. And I wondered maybe if Haley could speak a little to that and give us some good examples of where you're seeing this really, really work, and maybe where you've gone, hey, this wasn't the right tool for this particular need. We did pull back on it so that we can learn both directions.
Right, absolutely. And I completely agree. That's exactly how we started. We started with decentralized elements, a remote visit here and there, telehealth here and there. And then when COVID hit, we took on more of those decentralized elements, and we were able to continue to expand with each new trial.
That's the number one thing that aligned to me too. I remember Haley, she said, just start small, do something little. You don't have to go off to the deep end. And then Craig turned around. I could have sworn you talked to each other beforehand, because Craig came in here and said, everyone just if everyone just takes one little step, just take one little step toward this direction, do one little baby step, all those baby steps put together, they will add up to some pretty substantial things. So
and we have to remember that's the heart of all innovation.
Exactly.
I mean, think of all the technologies that we use all day, every day, that not but 5, 10, let alone 25 or 50 years ago, we would have been very reticent to use, or we would have been very concerned about the use, or we would have said, I'm not going to be first in line for that. That sounds like, like you said, Craig, crazy sci-fi talk. And yet now it's been completely integrated. We wouldn't know what to do without that technology, right? And so we had to find small ways to say yes slowly in our own comfort zones. Again, patient integrity, patient safety, or data integrity, excuse me, and patient safety at the forefront. But we can say yes. And I'd be very curious too, Craig, to hear, selfishly, since I wasn't able to attend DTRA, don't feel too sorry for me, I was on vacation. But I heard it was a great show. What's the temperature of the room to getting those small yeses to some of the bigger yeses? What are some of the success stories that we're hearing?
So I have to be honest with you. So to me, there's everybody should take one step forward, right? Whatever size step they're comfortable with, if they're a leaper, if they're a shuffler, like just take a step. But I do have another story that I use for the leaders in these organizations, whether sponsors or big site networks or otherwise. And for the leaders there, for the top-down aspect of managing change, it's commit. It's commit and invest, right? Because the change has to happen in two ways, right? We need everybody to be able to move forward as individuals, but real change doesn't happen if everybody is slowly taking small steps, right? Then we're talking like decades, right? We didn't move from paper to electronic data capture because everybody slowly switched their studies over, right? We made it because organizations said, hey, you know what? Julie over there is in charge of this switch. We're going to switch on July 1st. Here's an investment in an organization to support all the change and the processes globally for that to happen. And if it doesn't happen on July 1st, there's a team that's held accountable. And that's the other aspect of change that we haven't been so good at. But we know as organizations, that's how the bigger change happens. So what's it looking like in terms of the temperature with adoption right now? We are starting to see a number of pharma define a little more openly what some of their commitments and targets are in this area. Those targets, those KPIs, are what they as leaders will hold themselves and their teams accountable towards. And quite honestly, there are times over the past year that, I felt kind of down. Are we still making progress? Are we still committed to this stuff? Because all we see in the news are headcount reductions and portfolio assets getting scrapped and budgets getting cut and LinkedIn feed updates of friends that are getting displaced. And it's like, wow, like, are we going to be able to keep positive momentum, or are we just hunkering down to like the bare minimum? And just quite honestly, right? And then quite honestly, like coming out of this time with these leaders in these orgs and hearing like, oh no, we're at like 60% of our studies are including a decentralized element or other metrics like that. I'm like, damn, like we really are still maintaining that commitment to the patients that we say we're talking to and listening to when we hear that access is a barrier. So I kind of came out, not just excited because, you see the regulators saying the water is safe, you should come in, but, seeing the people that have been, grinding through a tough year in a tough environment and still being able to come away and say, our organization is doing this. It's great to see. And my hat is tipped to those people in the trenches, whether sponsor, site, CRO, tech providers that are making that happen.
And I'm so glad you said that, Craig, because it was something that came across my mind too. Haley, I wonder, as you are progressing through and as we've seen DCT, we have a final document now, we have things like that. Are you seeing hints of that in feasibilities or new trials that are coming across your desk?
Yes and no. So there are still, like from our point of view, very few sponsors that are willing to integrate decentralized methods. So like RPI just went to the NEI conference, and of all of the sponsors there, he said there was only one sponsor that was even remotely interested in decentralized.
So see,
of any tool, any skill set, anything.
Correct. Yeah.
And so it's interesting, right? Because like probably at a conference like that are individuals from different study teams that are on different points in that change curve. And very few sponsors at an enterprise level are dictating to those teams, thou shalt use video, you shall use mobile health. It really is still bringing those study teams along. And so I'm not surprised that there are definitely, different study teams. And it will also vary by therapeutic area where it's appropriate that, are comfortable there or are not. And it's also certainly varying a lot by organization in terms of how much they've helped to bring those organizations along. But Daniel, you mentioned that, what might be the sequelae of now there being final guidance. One thing in that final guidance is that your study documents, your protocol, your monitoring plan, your data management plan, they need to include certain references here to these decentralized methods.
Yes.
And so we were in a time over the last 2 years, 3 years, where protocols would get thrown over the wall to ClinOps, and some ClinOps leaders would kind of scramble around and say, I think I could do a mobile visit here, and maybe I could offer video over there. And you can't do that anymore. And so there's
that is a change.
Right? And so, Edie, there's going to be this period now where, like, if there were protocols that were finalized last week, ClinOps can't stuff any DCT magic in there anymore. Now we're going to be looking at the protocols that are still in the planning stages and making sure that we're fitting these thoughtful use of decentralized elements before the protocol is finalized. So there is going to be, like, I think, a little bit of a gap period here that if you just finished your protocol, it may be too late for you to bring a lot of meaningful decentralized access opportunities in.
I'm curious what this crowd thinks about the following information. And I think I know what you're going to say, but I'd be very curious. So the regulatory, like, creative individual in me goes, okay, if you had a champion and you had the right trial, you can amend a protocol. And you could, after the fact, now I'm not saying there's not money, time, effort, and all sorts of other politics involved in that. But if there was a champion, you're not completely past the limit from a strictly regulatory perspective. Because I get clients who will come to me and go, well, they said they can amend the protocol. The IRB will just never let you do that. And I'm like, that's not true. There's a little more to it than that. But if there's a champion, yes, you can, as long as it's, done correctly. What's the temperature of this room on that? And Craig's already smiling, so I know he's got something to say.
Look, I think,
Go ahead, Haley.
Haley, go ahead.
I was thinking the exact same thing. Like, you absolutely can amend a protocol if you have the feasibility to do so. That was literally like my first thought when you were mentioning protocols being completed. Now you're too late. We can always amend it. And especially now with the FDA guidance, the IRB is not going to deny it, not necessarily.
I think, Edie, there's that old Tufts data that it's a couple $1,000,000 to amend your protocol in terms of the time lags, the submissions, the effort that's required. But we also know that for most sponsors, most of their protocols are going to have a couple of amendments over their life cycle. So wait a minute and catch up with that next amendment that's going to end up happening, and use that window now to go into your other study documents that'll probably need to be amended as well, your monitoring plan, data management plan. Ideally, you're using this time to make sure it's in the templates themselves. So while you're doing it with a template, look for those opportunities to bring it into that next revision. And you might be catching that next protocol amendment wave, which, maybe you missed the train with the first final protocol. So wait a few minutes. There'll be another protocol amendment rolling.
I was going to say, I've yet to see a protocol that doesn't go through at least 10 amendments, right?
Right.
Yeah, it happens. And maybe you have like a protocol amendment wish list. Just put it on the next route, next cycle when it comes through. And is it worth it? I mean, I have seen
and it might not
already. Be. I've seen there are trials that are amending their protocol specifically to utilize DCT components.
Wow.
specifically.
Well, and I feel too, when the right people see the right numbers is when those things kind of go into place. So like our PI came back and told me that, the sponsors initially were to say, no, absolutely not to decentralized. But, the people who he was speaking to were very interested once they heard about the difference between our screening numbers, the difference between our enrollment numbers, the difference between, the ethnicities that were enrolling. We're able to access so many more people who would benefit so much more from these trials when you open it up like that.
And this goes back to Craig. I remember we talked a little bit about the beginning of DTRA, and there was a bit of a hype that came in. And then it kind of weeded out the hype people, and we left, I guess you said the tourists left. And it had the people who were really serious, like making this, they're kind of digging down and being a part of the community. Given the guidance, do you see another round of tourists entering the decentralized industry, or do you think everyone's kind of moved on to AI?
So it's a great question. So here's sort of the trend that I've seen around this. And you're right, and I'll credit my friend Chuka Esiobu from Define Ventures, who dropped that on a session we did together, that the tourists have left the room. That we if you just look at DTRA membership and what the meetings there have looked like, we had like so many of these companies that kind of swarmed in because there was a period where if you had DCT in your deck, it was a better chance of getting funded. And right now, if you have to have AI in your deck. So all of those companies, and by the way, those companies had blockchain in their deck and on their website, 5 years ago. And, I don't know what their buzzword will be 5 years from now, but, they've moved on. The sponsors in DTRA have never left. Every year we just get more sponsors as members. The stakeholder that was a little like wonky and on the fence there were so the tourists left, the sponsors stayed. Tech companies that were sort of purpose built for this, or service providers like mobile nursing, they never left. It was the CROs in sort of tech that support lots of different areas, sort of the generalist players in this space, that kind of looked and said, are people really committed to this DCT thing? Maybe we should be out of it. Maybe we shouldn't use the word anymore. Is it a bad word to use? Those were the organizations that would call me and say, can you rebrand DTRA to some other words? Because we can't sell decentralized anymore. It's not like getting us in the door with meetings anymore.
It's not the buzz.
Right? And it's those orgs that are kind of coming back now. Like ones that left saying, I can't sell this anymore, are kind of coming back because I think they're realizing that with final guidance, these words aren't going away. And the sponsors never left the room. So they're kind of coming back in. Tourists left. Purpose-built tech and service providers stayed, pharma stayed, and now those generalists, sort of CROs and others, are the ones that are kind of coming back into the house.
Yeah. Are you seeing?
And maybe for that purpose, the AI boom is a win in the sense of the tourists have another focal point for a while. And I don't mean that in a bad way. There's a lot of great work to be done in AI. I'm not criticizing that. But in terms of getting work done in this particular space, it's nice to know that maybe the tourists, if we will, have left the building and have something else to focus on and aren't necessarily going to boomerang just to boomerang. If they're making that comeback like you suggested, Craig, it's more meaningful, hopefully.
It's a great perspective on it. It's tourists in the room are a distraction, and they also bring risk because there's such little tolerance in this space for things to go wrong. And things will go wrong when it's your first time doing it. And if it's going wrong with somebody that shouldn't have even been in the room in the first place, there's not going to be that capacity for learning from it, from course correcting, from adapting. And trust me, and I'm not going to be the first to say this to your audience here, there are plenty of things that went wrong with decentralized tech and services over the last 3 or 4 years. The question is, have we learned from it and are we adapting? And this was actually a lot of the conversation with different sponsors last week at the DTRA annual meeting. When things went wrong, did your organization take that as this whole DCT stuff doesn't work, we're out? Or did your organization say, we have things we got to learn and figure out, adapt, and then scale? And we've got a bunch of them that took course B, but we know there are plenty that sort of landed in course A, and now they're doing a lot of catch up because they realize with final guidance and successful delivery happening in so many places that the water is okay. But it's only thanks to those that took course B and said, you know what, we're going to invest the effort to learn from what didn't work and get it right. And, thank you to those orgs.
So
I'd be curious. Oh, sorry.
So I was just going to ask Haley just to follow up on that.
That's what I was going to just say. That's exactly it. As I was going to say, I'm selfish because I only have a couple minutes left before I got to hop. I want to hear what Haley says from the trenches about who are you seeing, what's your percentage and your ratio of people going like, I tried it once, you said to try it, it didn't work, it's broke, I'm out, versus the people who went like, okay, maybe this didn't go exactly according to plan, but that doesn't mean we didn't learn something. That doesn't mean I don't want to try this again in another way or another iteration.
Right. So we really only have one sponsor who we do decentralized with. And they have been with us through the entire decentralized process. And we have learned so much together with trial and error, problem solution. We continue to, update our protocols, update our plans with every error that we see. It does take a lot of problem solving in the first few years, absolutely, without a doubt. But it also takes a lot of willpower and the willingness to educate yourself and educate the people around you.
That was so. Edie, you have to go, right?
I do. I've got 1 minute left. I just want to say thanks to this amazing crowd. If I could stay any longer, I absolutely would. I can't wait to catch up on the end of this episode, and thank you for the great work that you're doing.
All right. Bye, Edie. Thanks.
Thanks, Edie.
All right, we're going to adjust this. I'm going to put Craig up here. We did have one question for Haley, and I think I know this answer, but are you affiliated with the Louisiana site that had the DCT bus at SCRS? I think that's a reference to ResearchWorks. That's Catherine Doyle. Are you affiliated with her?
No, I'm not. But now I'm kicking myself for not going to SCRS because I really considered it, and I would have loved to meet them.
So Catherine's another really cool lady in the DCT world as far as sites go. She is known for her research bus, and she has taken that on tour. I know it was in Scottsdale at SCRS West for Tech, and she was also in Florida. So I highly recommend you check out ResearchWorks.
I love that.
And it's kind of a follow-up. So we were talking about tourists, so to speak, and like DTRA, they had tourists. Haley, on the site side, did you ever witness sites as tourists? In other words, they kind of did DCT when it was a hype, and now they don't do it anymore?
So to be completely honest, there are not a lot of sites in our area. So I don't really know of many people who do what we do here. We're, in Jackson, Mississippi. There's really not a lot of research out here. There's some, but not a ton. So we don't have a lot to compare to, really. And
what do you think, Craig? Did you ever hear about site tourists?
It's a great question. There's a lot of different archetypes of sites on this planet. I don't have to tell you that. I was in Australia about a week or two ago, and over there, they're pointing out to me, like, when you take off from your next flight, look at the hangar that says flying doctors when you're leaving. If we didn't have mobile health capability in this country, nobody, 90% of the physical space wouldn't have received care. Like it's all remote and rural and frontier, right? So by our language here. So in some geographies, these are just so ingrained in mainstream as just tools. I think though, for some sites during the pandemic, there are a lot of site networks that kind of took a defensive curiosity around this, right? Like, is this going to mess me up? Are there tools or system sponsors going to be forcing on me that I have to figure out? Are there investments that I have to make right now in my tech stack, in my enterprise, that sponsors are going to be expecting me to have, like video or e-consent, that maybe I don't have today? And in most cases, I think a lot of those sites kind of came away and said, no, it's not really going to mess me up. There may be some tools that sponsors are going to ask of me, but in most cases, they're still shoving those top down, which is disruptive, yes, but it's not expecting me to make a priority investments. And so a lot of those, I wouldn't have called them tourists. Well, maybe in a different type of way. They're almost like defensive, what do I need to know kind of tourists. And I think the reason they left the room is they realized it's not going to break my my business model.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I think what Haley's type of site knew before the pandemic is it's not going to break my model, but there are some clever investments I could do that can differentiate and enhance my model.
Oh yeah.
Absolutely. That was mine. So Haley, I know you said you guys work with Florence, and Florence is like your E-Reg. And if there were sites out there right now who are kind of interested in DCT but didn't know where to start, I know you said you started in little bitty increments. Mm-hmm. What is the order of priority of things you might want to invest in to really get going on DCT, starting with the most important and then moving on to maybe what's more supplemental?
Most important, I would say, is some type of telehealth platform.
Okay.
That way you can, complete remote visits with, the coordinators, with the physicians, PIs, sub-Is. That would be the absolute most important, would be to integrate telehealth. I think next would be probably some form of e-consent, or even not even necessarily e-consent, but some form of e-signature platform.
Okay.
And then electronic storage. I think those are going to be the main three things that you need.
And Haley, for you, for the telehealth aspect, was that a capability that already existed in something in your stack like CTMS or eReg Binder? Was it something that your practice already had and how it provided care, or did you have to go out and procure something new?
So it was actually something that we already had integrated into our EMR. So it was pretty easy for us to roll right into that.
And that means your investigators as providers were already familiar with it, kind of knew how to make it work in their workflow.
Correct.
Great. And then for e-consent, you probably, I'm guessing, found the same. I know Florence and some of the CTMS providers have that kind of native for you.
Yeah, there's a lot of options out there now, but when it came to the e-consent and e-reg, our sponsor provided that. But if they didn't, I don't think it would have been too difficult to secure.
Yeah. Cool.
There are many options out there right now.
Yeah.
We have this initiative we shared an update on last week in DTRA that's being led with folks from GSK and Mayo and some other groups. And the theme is really for those sites that have certain capability in their tech stack with which they're already familiar and trained, like e-consent. How do we make sure that sponsors and CROs know how to let them use it and not force unfamiliar tech on sites that already have something in place? And I think e-consent's a good starting place for that conversation. If you're a site that for all of your investigator-initiated or grant-funded research, you're e-consenting on the same platform and all your coordinators know how to use it for those purposes, but every time a sponsor and a CRO show up with sponsored research, it's a whole other bunch of e-consent tools showing up. That's not quality by design, right? That's just chaos for everyone. And from a sponsor perspective, the only thing I cared about as a sponsor were signatures, dates, and versions. The rest of it should be up to you. And so how do we drive the interoperability so I can get those three things I cared about, signatures, dates, and versions, that I can know that what you're using is going to be fine. It's some sort of compliant by some norm or standard tool, and then Godspeed. If it works right for your environment, you should use it. And if you don't have one, fine, we'll provision one like we have to date.
So I wonder, Haley, and there's a couple things that have happened since we recorded this. And I think one of the most important parts is that we do have now a final DCT guidance that is given out. And just as Craig was saying, odds are that's probably getting built into RFPs right now, which means sites probably won't see it for maybe 2 years or so. But Haley, when the final guidance came out, and I don't know if you read the draft guidance, but how did you feel as a site when you read that on maybe some of the steps that you're going to take to be ready for this?
I was excited to see that, it was finalized, but I was disappointed at how other sites reacted to it. Like, everyone seemed to have had a negative reaction. I would like to dive deeper into the guidance and try to kind of mitigate some of that negativity. I haven't had the chance to do that yet, but it is a plan.
Well, I will tell you that's planned right over here. So let's keep you in mind for that. We're going to do a deep dive, and we'll be ready for that.
We had Care El-Zarad from FDA, who runs medical policy, on stage last week. And, I kind of commiserated with him that whatever guidance you put out, half the people are going to say it's too vague, it's not meaningful, you're too high level, and half are going to say the complete opposite. This is so specific about X or Y that this is going to box me in, and this is bad. So it is hard to create a guidance that gets, everybody or anybody sometimes happy.
Mm-hmm.
But I get it that, even though some of the ambiguity of what's a task log, right, from the draft that a lot of people got very anxious about, they listened, it's not there, but it still leaves a lot of questions, I think, for investigators and sites for us to collectively figure out and learn. How do sites and staff ensure proper oversight with different decentralized elements in a trial, whether it's a connected device, a mobile nurse that's contracted, or an HCP, a provider in the community setting that's supporting routine care. That's a lot of complexity in terms of oversight. One best or better practice out there is certainly to make sure sites are getting compensated for their time for oversight. So nobody developing a budget should take a line item and say, oh, that's happening over there, so my site doesn't have to get paid. If there's oversight, they need their time for it. But how do we make sure we're not just crushing staff with oversight responsibilities that they're not prepared to properly have eyes on and to manage?
So for me, it was, and I read the draft very carefully. And Craig, I'm so glad you brought up task logs, because that was something that just everyone had a fit about. But I noticed a few really interesting differences in the draft guidance for DCT versus the final guidance. And the biggest difference I found was actually in, we're going to move into the world of HCP procurement here for a minute. So selection of HCP offices so that you can go to a doctor's office for a visit. It moved away from the site. In the draft, it said the investigator and the sponsor together will select these HCP offices. And it moved closer to the investigator is responsible for patient safety and oversight, and the sponsor is required to do the procurement of HCP offices, which at first I thought, well, that's kind of weird. And, for the site and me said, well, whatever it might be. But then I realized, okay, wait a minute. So the sponsor is procuring a place for patients to go to do a visit. They have to do essentially what is like a task log, all of the qualifications of the HCP networks. They have to train and qualify all the facilities. And then the site is responsible for patient safety. And then I realized, oh my goodness, as soon as I read this, the FDA has pretty much created a DCT workflow that's almost identical to central labs. This is what happens in central labs all the time. Sponsors procure labs, they procure the companies that do the labs, and then they instruct the sites to send labs to a centralized location where there can be a standardized service. So in that event, if you were to associate something that is all scary and creepy, and you associate it to something that is pretty much just standard across the industry, it's just like central labs. How do you feel that would make sites feel, Haley, after, they got the negative treatment about that? But then if you're like, dude, your FDA structured this like central labs, how would you feel about that as an explanation?
I think that's a great explanation. And I didn't even think of that, but I absolutely agree. Really, if you try to compare what you're already doing a lot of the guidance kind of reflects that. I think people are taking some things out of context and making them a lot more complicated than they need to be. But really, it's not so different than what, physicians did with telehealth during COVID at all.
Yep. So what do you think,
I think the hope and the wish would be that our patients are kind of selecting the HCPs because we're able to engage with patients who can almost bring their HCP along. But I realize that's kind of more of an end state than necessarily otherwise. Plus, it's interesting how many sponsors are almost considering some of HCP recruitment as just a part of their overall recruitment strategy, that this is how I'm going to be engaging patients to become aware of my clinical trial, is going to be through these HCP offices where the patients are and where they're already receiving care. It's interesting to call out examples like central labs, because I'm not sort of making up on the show here. Clayton Christensen in The Innovator's Prescription and Innovator's Dilemma originally described how centralization of some services enables decentralized or distributed other services. In a past life, I ran a central imaging core lab. We have central IRBs. We have central labs for other types of specimens. All of that centralization, in many ways, is part of what helps us to enable the use of more distributed and decentralized tools and approaches. The two don't compete with each other. They actually enable one another. In the case of Christensen, it was describing how big academic centers with highly specialized services are what would ultimately enable things like minute clinics and other types of, easy access, low acuity care to become more widespread in the community. With a lot of this HCP engagement, the goal is that we're not training them, right? The goal is we're letting them only do things for which they're already trained. And if much additional training is needed, then they're actually crossing the threshold to being on the 1572 as investigators by our delegation of authority.
And I'm so glad you quoted Clayton again, Craig, because when you quoted him in the original interview, I looked him up and I read it. I'm so very glad that you referenced that. And I would recommend, if you are interested in DCT, you need to check out Clayton Christensen. This is the perfect segue to the draft that you referenced in the beginning. So now that we have a DCT final guidance, DCT's okay. Here's a guidance. It's final. This is the FDA's view on DCT. By the way, here's a draft guidance to try to expand into that relationship with the local HCP offices for randomized clinical trials in a healthcare setting. Craig, what do you think of that draft guidance, and where do you think that's going to go when it complements the final DCT guidance?
So didn't see that coming, to be honest. I was pleasantly surprised, because to me, again, that role of the HCP supporting routine care is one of the most novel parts of the DCT guidance now final. And to see that really blown out further in a standalone guidance, I think was really exciting. For me, when I would look at the role of the HCP in our trials, to be honest, I was thinking very much around physical exams, phlebotomy, just very primary care types of routine care activities. In that draft guidance, they're going deep, right? They're talking about biopsies, they're talking about endoscopies. If it's routine care, if that's what that provider does, then that's what they can, and it's routine care in the protocol, then that's fine. But what I also like about that draft guidance, and why it's a great read for people, is it kind of says, here are some things you could do this way, here are some things you can't do this way, right? It gives you some really nice guardrails, which again, it's draft. I think, people should be reading it that way and should be reacting to it that way and sharing feedback with the agency with that in mind. I think the other takeaway from that draft to me is just a reminder for folks that the FDA writes guidance in silos, and that here's an RWD, a real world data draft. Here's a pragmatic trials, opinion. Here's a DCT opinion. But in a lot of ways, these things are pieces of a story that are meant to fit together. And so how do we start to see, the right future for us when we take a lot of these pieces and start to see how they actually are intersecting and telling one story? These are just chapters.
And Haley, have you had a chance to read the draft guidance yet?
I have not, but now it's on my to-do list.
All right, so I'll paint a picture for you. I imagine a world where essentially the sponsor is kind of like a consumer for healthcare, where, how we were just talking about local labs or central labs, take that to the next level, where the sponsor is like a patient walking into a healthcare facility, opting to work with that healthcare facility to perform routine healthcare. And then utilizing the site specifically for patient safety and oversight, almost like the site would now be like a research specialty where they're still going to perform trials. They're still going to do everything accordingly. But anything that's like standard of care, very similar to central labs, could be sent to a specialized and standardized and qualified HCP office with a direct relationship between the sponsor and the healthcare provider. How do you feel about that as a site?
Well, so I guess my experience is similar to that in the first place, because we're in a physician's office, we're in a psychiatric office. So it's similar to exactly what you explained, rather it is the PI's practice rather than it being the sponsor.
Yeah. So you're already like a specialized department built into a practice.
Correct.
Which means that you're already at that specialized level. You provide research support for someone who's got a practice.
Right.
Which means if they were to walk into there and go to your practice as a healthcare consumer, not for research, but say, hey, I want our patients to come in here for a physical exam. That's it. You would be, because you're already kind of at that level. It's going to be interesting for those freestanding sites, the ones that sit there and say, well, we want the trial participants to come to our site. So we do everything, physical exam, vitals, everything, boom, everything that's standard of care, everything that's research related at this private site. That is going to be where it's going to be separated out, where the routine of care services that are a part of a trial are going to be specialized, just like central labs, get back to the central labs, to healthcare providers. And then the research sites will be doing only the focused research work. That's how I interpreted it, Craig. How do you feel about that interpretation?
I think a lot of it in ideal state, like other decentralized methods, should be driven by the patient and patient preference. And so if they have a local provider that reduces burden and increases trust and gives us an opportunity to include them, then fabulous. If they just want everything study related to happen through their study site, then that should be, a capability that we're honoring. If that site has that, the ability to support those different, additional procedures. If that future plays out the way you described, Dan, I think there's a future out there that sees, research sites really focusing on high acuity special procedures that are truly unique research grade procedures, which quite honestly, at a time when so many sites are struggling for staff and struggling for qualified coordinators, is that a bad future, where we're relying on the healthcare system to support the things that they do every day, and we're just focusing our limited resources, limited talent on the things in the study that are truly unique research grade things.
And if you look at healthcare in general, that's kind of how healthcare evolved. We had these generalists, these internal medicine people, the folks that have their patients, the standard of care. And then if something goes really weird, they get referred off to a specialist, a cardiologist, an endocrinologist, and some kind of an ologist. it's very possible that research could be one of those ologists. You could be a researchologist baked. Just Haley, it sounds like that's kind of what you do. You are the researchologist in your private practice. And
Basically.
so that might be kind of where it is, where we can concentrate these really highly qualified, specialized individuals to do what they're really good at without having to do something that maybe a generalist could do at a healthcare facility.
That's fascinating. The researchologist.
The researchologist. Yeah, we could be researchologists, Craig.
Right? And you're just focusing on those specialized things, which in this case, the specialized things are research-only practices, research-only requirements that are not routinely performed elsewhere in the healthcare system.
Yeah. I mean, why are you paying a very high premium for a highly qualified and experienced PI to perform a physical exam, a routine physical exam, when you could focus their efforts on being the research professionals they are, and then letting those standard of care services being performed within a healthcare setting where it's already standardized and ready to go. So it's interesting. Kelvin, I love you too, my friend. Thank you so much. Kelvin says specialization is more prominent in AMCs. Yes, it's very, very common in academic medical centers. But even now, like here in this research desert, one of our physician practices, they are the specialists and they serve the hospitals. So there's the whole evolution of healthcare. And again, this goes into my theory. I really do believe that research will eventually be ingested by the healthcare industry as another specialty. We are going down that path. And these two guidances, I really do think are starting to support that theory.
That's an interesting way to describe a potential future there. Now, it's interesting, of course, and I like that last perspective, that type of specialization is already sort of tuned in academic medical centers. You know, we do have good chunks of this country and certainly good chunks of our planet that are rural, frontier, or otherwise, and access is very different. But there as well, it tracks what you're describing. If you have one resource that is getting on a plane and flying out to that region to provide care, how do you leverage that resource to provide everything that they can under their license and training? And so if there are routine care procedures for that protocol, don't put a second body on a second plane, right? Let's just take advantage of the resources that we're getting out to those remote regions.
Yeah. So I mean, and there's so many different ways to think about that. And we know that Walgreens was just awarded the DCOR award. And so they are working with DCOR to help with decentralized technologies for Walgreens to try to fight these research deserts, to try to gain access to these groups. I think that, you know, given the mission of DCOR is pretty much, it was a grant that it said in the grant that the inability to access research could be considered a public health emergency. We all know that was a lesson learned from COVID. I don't know where you were for the first couple months of COVID, but it was a lot of people twiddling their thumbs, wondering what we're going to do. So this would have been a reaction. It would have been saying, okay, we need to be able to have more accessible research in the event of a public health emergency, specifically for rural areas. And so DCOR came out and Walgreens got the DCOR award. And so now we're going to fight that. We're going to try to figure out how to fight the research deserts using already established infrastructures that is throughout the community, which is healthcare and pharmacy.
But we know it's not easy, right?
It's not easy.
But I guess if it were easy, it would have been done by now. For folks that in your audience that aren't familiar, BARDA is the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority. It's sort of your department of your federal government that is prepared for the next public health emergency. And as a part of that is sort of this DCOR program that Daniel was mentioning of having research-ready infrastructure for that next emergency that can be quickly activated. And the best way to keep it warm and ready for emergencies is to make it used. So it's not just sitting on a shelf, you know, gathering dust, but, you know, you want to keep the engine actually warm and actually supporting other types of studies and capability. look, it's not a. I'm sure when anybody hears Walgreens in clinical trials, they immediately think, well, whatever happened to CVS and Walmart and all the others that kind of have come and left because it's
They were
hard.
tourists, Craig.
Well, these are hard areas in which to actually grow and to deliver. But, for those that outlast and figure out the models and take it stepwise, there is a great future out there.
Mm-hmm.
A great future in terms of improving access for people that are otherwise without.
So I did want to go. So Kelvin asked a question. Kelvin said, I read about the task logs and the DCT guidance. Can you clarify when it will be implemented? Kelvin, the task log did not make the cut. So in the final guidance, there is no task log. Instead, it was ingested into the qualification requirements of a sponsor to HCP offices. And so therefore, as a result, what's the difference between the task log and the delegation log? Well, so the delegation of authority log, that would be that log that's maintained by the PI at the site. And now the task log, which is no more, is the series of qualifications that a sponsor will maintain on HCP networks.
And that was because of the agency listening to you, right? Like they got 800, 900 comments. I don't know what chunk of them said the words task log ? But a lot of them did. And, that voice was heard.
Yeah. All right. So we're at 57 minutes. What a wonderful conversation. Let's go ahead and wrap this up. So if I were to hand each of you the microphone and I said, what would you like to tell the entire industry about DCTs, where we're at now, and where you would like to see it go, what would you like to tell them? And we'll start with Haley.
Let's see. So really, decentralized is not complicated. It does take a lot of effort into gaining knowledge yourself, trial and error, problem solving, great qualities to have if you're considering decentralized, but it's really not so different than what you're probably already doing.
Perfect. Craig, how would you like to wrap it up?
There's a quote I heard last week from somebody who said, don't be afraid to use decentralized elements in your studies. The only hook is the quote came from Eric Pittman, who's one of the heads of bioresearch monitoring at FDA. So this is the guy that's out leading inspections at sites for clinical trials today. And he's the one saying, don't be afraid to use these methods. In the videos on my LinkedIn feed of him saying this, so you don't have to believe me. I'll kind of tag you guys as well. But the takeaway from him is your inspector's going to ask questions, but they're going to be the same kinds of questions they always ask about safety and data integrity. A couple of extra questions, sure, nothing unfamiliar, nothing that's new to anyone who's worked in this field for more than a minute.
Exactly. So I seriously do see a world with healthcare integration. I know some people don't like that because it sounds too techy, but I really do think that the research industry will be integrated into healthcare in the future. Going to a clinical trial, being a participant in a clinical trial will be no different from going to your doctor's office for your routine annual physical exam. It's going to be like that. And now that I know, Craig, I think you posted something about PTO being allowed to be part of a trial now, which is amazing, or family medical leave.
Family medical leave, opinion from the Department of Justice, Department of Labor, yeah.
If you're going to get paid to be part of jury duty, where you're doing that, you should be able to get paid as a stipend to be part of a clinical trial. This is going to be integrated into our society, but awareness is key. I can guarantee you right now, if you're watching this, you go out in your community, local coffee shop, grocery store, church, whatever, the number of people who know about clinical trials will be far less. There'll be unicorns in your community. We need to make those unicorns common. You need to let people know that clinical research is a thing. It's not just for super desperate people, and it's not just for super sick people. It's something that we all need to come together as people in this society to help to develop better medicine for generations to come, for everyone. So let's stop at that. So thank you so much, Craig and Haley, for coming on to CRPN Central. This is Dr. Fox. Please like, comment, subscribe, support this mission and support this channel. I'll see you guys next time. Bye, everyone.